In the year 1519, the sun rose over the Gulf of Mexico like any other day. Fishermen mended nets along the jagged coast, children chased iguanas through the sand, and traders paddled canoes laden with obsidian, cacao and jade. But something unusual appeared on the horizon, a glint of metal and the white sails of ships cutting through the waves. To the people of the Aztec world, these were no ordinary vessels. They carried strangers from a distant land, men with pale skin, strange clothes, and weapons that reflected the sunlight like shards of fire. Imagine standing on that shore. You've spent your entire life in a world ruled by gods and emperors, where cities rise like mountains from the earth, and priests walk among humans as living conduits to the divine. And then, out of the endless blue, ships appear, and with them men who speak in a tongue you cannot understand, wield tools you've never seen, and carry a presence that is both foreign and terrifying. That day, the Aztec world unknowingly stepped onto the first page of a story that would change everything. Among these strangers was Hernán Cortés, a man of ambition so sharp it could slice through kingdoms. He was not the tallest, nor the strongest, nor the most noble-born, but he possessed a hunger few could match. From the very moment he set foot on this foreign shore, his eyes were not on the waves, not on the palm trees, not on the bustling markets he glimpsed from the coast. They were fixed on one goal: power, absolute, unrelenting, and personal. Cortés would not be content with gold, or titles, or fleeting respect. He wanted legacy. He wanted a name that would echo through the centuries, and he believed the Aztec Empire, the jewel of the New World, was the stage for his ambition. The local people watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. These men were unlike any they had seen. Their armor glinted in the sunlight, their horses thundered across the shore, and their crossbows cracked with a sound that made birds scatter in alarm. Horses, creatures that had never existed in the Americas, were monstrous and beautiful at once. They were beasts of war, carrying riders who could strike down a man from a distance, and the Aztecs had no frame of reference to understand them. Imagine seeing a creature twice the size of a bull, moving faster than any human could, with a man on its back commanding it as if it were an extension of his own body. Fear mixed with fascination, curiosity wrestled with caution. The tension was tangible, like the air before a storm breaks. But Cortés did not rely solely on spectacle. He had a plan, and every glance, every word, every gesture was calculated to unsettle, to dominate, and to manipulate. He carried letters from the Spanish crown, promising friendship, trade, and faith, yet his true weapons were deception, strategy, and the ability to exploit the cracks within the Aztec world. He understood something few outsiders ever would. Empires are not only held together by armies and walls, they are fragile constructs of fear, loyalty, religion, and politics. And in these fissures, a clever man could plant seeds that would eventually topple the mightiest of thrones. To the Aztecs, the strangers were initially puzzling. Were they gods? Some scholars later argued that the timing coincided with certain prophecies, a belief that a pale-skinned deity might return from the east. Moctezuma, the emperor, hesitated. He sent emissaries bearing gifts, trying to understand the nature of these visitors without committing to hostility. This hesitation would prove costly. History would remember it as wisdom, diplomacy, or weakness depending on who tells the story. But in that moment it was survival walking a razor's edge. For Cortés, every day on that coast was a negotiation of perception and fear. He needed to appear respectful, yet dominant, curious, yet invincible, friendly, yet unflinchingly ambitious. He mingled with translators, nobles and traders, observing rituals, studying hierarchies, and taking meticulous mental notes. Every smile, every bow, every offering was catalogued. Every misstep, every whisper of dissent, every fear was a tool to be wielded later. By the time the ships anchored fully, the Spaniards had begun to weave themselves into the tapestry of Aztec life, not as invaders in the traditional sense, but as silent predators sizing up their prey. Meanwhile, life in Tenochtitlan, the floating city of the Aztec heartland, continued unaware of the storm approaching. Children played along canals, farmers tended their chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the empire, and priests chanted prayers to Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. Yet across the water, the Spaniards were learning, adapting, and preparing. Every glance, every encounter, every gift was a thread in a web that would one day ensnare the mightiest empire the Americas had ever known. And here's the chilling part. From the very first day, the seeds of conquest were planted, not with swords, but with observation, deception, and psychology. Cortés understood that empires could fall as easily to cunning as to steel. He saw weakness in protocol, in faith, in succession disputes, and in human nature itself. And the people who greeted him with cautious hospitality could not yet know that their world as they had known it for centuries would never be the same again. Imagine standing there, watching ships vanish on the horizon as the Spaniards push inland for the first time. Imagine feeling both awe and dread. You are witnessing a collision of worlds, a moment when destiny is being rewritten. That day, 1519, was not merely the arrival of strangers. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The Aztec Empire would not fall overnight, but the first threads of its unraveling were being pulled, and Hernán Cortés, ambitious beyond reason, would be the man doing the pulling. History often tells us about battles, sieges, and gold taken, but the truth is more intimate, more terrifying. The conquest began with eyes, with patience, with subtle manipulations. It began not with screaming warriors, but with quiet observation, clever deception, and the calculated planting of fear. And from that first moment on the shores of Mexico, the Spaniards and their unstoppable leader set the stage for one of the most shocking and transformative moments in human history. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in a small town in Extremadura, Spain. By most accounts, he was unremarkable as a child, neither particularly wealthy nor especially powerful. His family owned a modest estate, and like many boys of his class, he learned to read, write, and ride a horse. But there was something in him that set him apart, a hunger that no classroom, no village, no river valley could satisfy. From the moment he first looked beyond the horizon, he wanted more, not just land or wealth or titles. He wanted history itself. Think about that for a moment. A boy born in a quiet, dusty town, dreaming not of a comfortable life, but of carving his name into the world's memory. Imagine feeling so small, so insignificant, that the only way to survive the boredom of life was to imagine power, to imagine conquest. Cortés was that boy, and that desire would not only define his life, it would define the fate of millions. By the time he reached adulthood, Cortés had already experienced a taste of danger and ambition. He studied law at the University of Salamanca, but the lectures bored him. He rode horses, fenced and trained with weapons, but his real education came from the stories of explorers, conquistadors and soldiers who had returned from the New World with tales of gold, glory and kingdoms waiting to be claimed. Every story was a spark, every rumor a flame. He dreamed not of living under kings, but of becoming one. And yet, for all his dreams, Cortés was not a man who inherited opportunity. He was, in every sense, a nobody. He had no army of followers, no political connections of consequence, and no treasure to call his own, but he had something far more dangerous: ambition. It is one thing to want, it is another to act. Cortés acted. He joined the expedition to the Americas in 1504, not because he was ordered to, or because someone trusted him, but because he recognized that greatness could only be seized, it could never be inherited. The New World, in all its chaos and mystery, offered him the perfect stage. He watched others stumble, struggle, and die, and he learned from every failure. He noticed patterns in loyalty and betrayal, in greed and fear. He realized that ordinary men often overestimate their courage and underestimate their ambition. And he decided, quietly but decisively, that he would not be ordinary. He would not wait for the crown to notice him. He would make his own destiny. By the time he reached the shores of Mexico in 1519, Cortés had honed his understanding of power to an almost terrifying degree. He knew that sheer force alone would never be enough to topple an empire. He would need cunning, diplomacy, manipulation, and a willingness to do things others would never dare. He was fearless, yes, but also strategic. He observed human nature like a scientist studies a specimen, calculating how far he could push, where weakness lay, and how fear could be turned into obedience. And here is the shocking part. Cortés' ambition was not tempered by morality. He was willing to exploit anyone and everyone, his men, rival tribes, the Aztec people, if it served his goal. To him, loyalty was temporary, obedience conditional, and life expendable if it stood in the way of success. He was not evil in the cartoonish sense. He was pragmatic, ruthless, and unrelenting. And history would remember this combination as genius, cruelty, or both, depending on who told the story. Imagine standing beside him as he steps onto the Mexican coast. You see a man of ordinary stature, but every movement, every word exudes confidence that feels impossible. You sense his mind always 3 steps ahead, calculating, anticipating, manipulating. He talks to the locals politely, bows when necessary, smiles when appropriate, yet behind every gesture is a plan. He is building an empire in his head before he even touches the land. Cortés understood one fundamental truth that most men of his time either ignored or feared. Kingdoms are fragile. Empires are collections of people, and people are full of contradictions, ambition, envy, faith, and fear. A clever man could exploit these contradictions and turn them into power. Cortés did not see the Aztecs merely as an empire to conquer. He saw them as humans whose desires, doubts, and traditions could be bent to serve his purpose. And this is where ambition becomes dangerous. Cortés' hunger was so vast that it made him fearless, not just of battle, but of consequences. He disobeyed orders from the Spanish crown, risked mutiny among his men, and played rival indigenous groups against each other. Every risk he took was a gamble, yet every gamble was guided by an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. Ordinary men crumble under such weight. Cortés carried it effortlessly, like armor. By the time the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma first heard of this pale-skinned stranger arriving on the coast, Cortés had already become a force larger than himself. He was not merely a soldier or an explorer. He was ambition personified, a man who could shape history because he refused to accept limits. History would judge him as a conqueror, a hero, or a villain. But in 1519, Cortés was simply a man who refused to be ordinary. And that refusal, combined with a mind trained to manipulate, a heart hardened by desire, and an uncanny understanding of human nature, set the stage for a collision that would shake the world. Imagine knowing, even for a moment, the mind of Hernán Cortés. You would see a man whose dreams outweigh morality, whose vision stretches beyond borders, whose ambition eclipses fear. That man, ordinary in birth but extraordinary in drive, had arrived in a land ruled by gods, prophecy, and centuries of tradition, and nothing would ever be the same again. Long before Cortés set foot on the shores of Mexico, the Aztec Empire thrived like no other civilization in the Americas. It was the year 1519, and Tenochtitlán, the jewel of this empire, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a city of dreams carved from stone and devotion. Canals crisscrossed the city like veins, carrying canoes laden with maize, cacao, and gold. Towers gleamed in the sunlight, markets buzzed with traders shouting prices, and priests moved with silent authority, performing rituals that maintained the balance between gods and men. To witness Tenochtitlan was to see a civilization at the height of its power, confident, proud, and unshakable. Imagine walking its streets. Everywhere you look, there is wealth, sophistication, and life. Merchants display intricately carved obsidian knives and feathers of the quetzal bird, shimmering in colors no artist could truly capture. Children play in plazas while elders trade gossip and advice, their lives intertwined with the pulse of the city. Yet beneath this vibrant surface, a tension thrums, one rooted in faith, hierarchy, and the unyielding demands of an empire built on conquest. The Aztecs did not just live in a city, they lived in a machine that demanded order, obedience, and sacrifice. At the heart of it all was Moctezuma II, the emperor. To his people, he was both man and conduit to the gods, the living embodiment of the divine will. His words shaped destinies, his gaze could inspire loyalty or terror, and yet even a ruler so mighty was bound by the customs and prophecies of his civilization. Moctezuma's life was not his own. Every decision carried weight, political, spiritual, and social. One wrong move could unravel alliances, spark rebellion, or offend the gods themselves. Religion dominated every corner of Aztec life. The empire's success, its wealth, its very survival, was tied to the favor of deities like Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. And the price of maintaining that favor was unthinkable to modern eyes: human sacrifice. Every captured warrior, every tribute from conquered peoples, every prisoner brought to the temples was offered to the gods in blood. Imagine watching priests, faces hidden behind feathered headdresses, performing ceremonies on the towering steps of the Templo Mayor, while drums thundered and flames licked the sky. To the Aztecs, these rituals were necessary, sacred, and the ultimate proof of devotion. To outsiders, it would later seem brutal, but for them it was life itself. The empire was also a marvel of organization. Roads linked distant cities, canals supplied the capital, and tribute flowed from provinces with astonishing efficiency. Farmers cultivated chinampas, artificial islands that fed tens of thousands, while artisans crafted jewelry, pottery, and weapons that would awe visitors from across the world. The Aztecs were not primitive nor naive. They were disciplined, intelligent, and adaptive. But this very discipline, this faith in their structures and gods, made them vulnerable in ways they could not foresee. The people were loyal, but their loyalty came with conditions. The empire expanded by conquest, and each victory brought not only land and wealth, but also resentment. Neighboring tribes chafed under Aztec rule, some nursing grudges for generations. Cortés, with his sharp eye, would later exploit this. But at this moment, the Aztecs did not yet see the cracks forming in their empire. To them, the arrival of foreigners was curious, perhaps even portentous, but not yet a threat they could comprehend. Every market, every temple, every bustling street was a display of the empire's might, yet it was a fragile might, balanced on faith, fear, and tradition. Citizens wore their status on their clothing, nobles adorned in jaguar skins and gold jewelry, warriors marked by feathers denoting their kills, commoners in humble cotton tunics. And while the city thrived, inequality was stark. The conquered paid tribute, the elite feasted, and the priests ensured that the divine order remained unquestioned. Imagine living in this world, believing that every action, every breath, every harvest is part of a cosmic design. That certainty gave life meaning, but it also blinded people to the changes about to come. This was a society confident in its superiority, yet tightly bound by ritual and hierarchy. Outsiders were rare, curiosity mixed with fear, and everything was explained through gods, prophecy, and destiny. The empire seemed invincible, a perfect combination of intelligence, wealth, and devotion. And yet, as history would prove, perfection can be fragile. A single man, a single decision, a single misstep could unravel even the most intricate of empires. By the time Cortés' ships appeared on the horizon, the Aztec Empire had reached its zenith, unmatched in beauty, wealth, and power. And yet, that very power created vulnerabilities. Their faith made them hesitant. Their rituals made them predictable. Their dominance over enemies bred resentment. and their confidence made them blind to the idea that a handful of outsiders, armed with steel, horses and cunning, could exploit everything they held dear. To the people of Tenochtitlán, life continued with its usual rhythm. Children played, priests chanted, warriors trained. Yet, unbeknownst to them, the first threads of their empire's unraveling were already being pulled. The strangers on the shore were patient, observant, and calculating. They did not attack immediately. They did not destroy temples or burn villages on sight. No, they studied, learned, and waited. And in this patient observation lay the true beginning of conquest, a conquest that would not just topple kings, but shatter the very understanding of life, power, and survival in the new world. Imagine standing atop the Templo Mayor, looking out over the city, feeling the sun on your face, believing in the eternal strength of your civilization. And then imagine the ripple of fear, the subtle unease, the sense that something monumental, unstoppable, and terrifying is approaching. That is the Aztec world before the fall. Magnificent, confident, unshakable, yet on the brink of destruction. Cortés' journey to Mexico was never meant to be a story of conquest. Officially, he was meant to explore, trade, and report back to the governor of Cuba, Velázquez. But Hernán Cortés had no intention of being a messenger, a bureaucrat, or a subordinate. From the moment he set sail, he viewed every rule, every command, and every chain of authority as a challenge to his ambition. Imagine knowing the crown has entrusted you with a mission, and instead of following orders, you quietly plot to become more powerful than anyone imagined. That was Cortés in 1519. Before leaving Cuba, Velázquez appointed him as captain of the expedition, but with strict limits. Cortés was not supposed to conquer, not supposed to claim territory, not supposed to provoke a kingdom. He was supposed to observe and report. But ambition, like wildfire, is rarely constrained by orders. Cortés gathered men, ships, and supplies, and on the eve of departure, he made a choice that would define history. He secretly prepared to act as if he were the master of his own destiny, even if it meant defying the Spanish crown. It was a dangerous gamble. Disobeying royal orders was treason, punishable by death, and yet Cortés' audacity matched his intelligence. He burned his ships upon reaching the mainland, a dramatic gesture meant to eliminate any thought of retreat. No turning back, no safety, no excuses. The message to his men, and to himself, was clear: we either succeed here, or we die trying. Imagine standing on the beach, watching your only way home sink beneath the waves. The fear is immediate, the stakes are absolute, and the ambition uncontainable. This act alone revealed the depth of Cortés's character. He did not rely on luck, charm, or diplomacy alone. He forced commitment, both from himself and from his men. Every sailor, every soldier, now faced the same brutal truth: there was no option but forward. Cortés understood that fear and necessity were powerful motivators, more effective than gold, more binding than loyalty to a distant king. He turned desperation into discipline, and discipline into conquest. As the expedition moved inland, Cortés exploited rivalries among indigenous peoples. He observed carefully which tribes resented Aztec rule and which were loyal. Where others saw a unified empire, Cortés saw cracks and fault lines waiting to be exploited. He promised freedom, protection, and vengeance to tribes who joined him, all while knowing he would bend or break those promises if necessary. His vision was ruthless but brilliant. He understood one essential truth: the Aztec Empire was strong, but it was not invincible. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable but essential. Cortés' rebellion against the Spanish crown was not just political. It was moral in its audacity and ethical in its complexity. He challenged authority, but he did so with strategy, intelligence, and timing. He knew the crown might condemn him, yet he trusted his ability to manipulate circumstance and create a reality where he could claim success before anyone could intervene. It was a dangerous, audacious gamble, the kind that can lead to either glory or ruin. Cortés' defiance also shaped the psychology of his men. Some feared him, some followed blindly, and others were inspired, but all understood that they were part of a mission that had no precedent, no rules, and no safety net. Cortés' leadership was a mixture of charm, fear, and inspiration. He understood how to bend human nature to his will, and by burning the ships, he ensured that no one could waver. Every man was invested in the outcome. Every man had no choice but to commit fully to the perilous path ahead. By the time they approached the territories of the Aztec Empire, the expedition had transformed. It was no longer a sanctioned voyage. It was a private army, united by ambition, fear, and loyalty to a single man. Cortés had broken the law, broken convention, and broken trust with his superiors. Yet he had also created a force capable of toppling one of the most powerful empires in the Americas. This duality defines Cortés, daring enough to defy authority, clever enough to turn that defiance into absolute advantage. And here's the part that often gets lost in history. This rebellion against the crown was not reckless. Cortés was calculating every move. He understood the political consequences in Spain, the risks among his men, and the cultural shock of confronting the Aztec world. Yet he also understood that extraordinary reward is never achieved by the ordinary path. To conquer an empire, he had to become extraordinary, audacious, ruthless, and unstoppable. Imagine the weight of this decision. Cortés could have followed orders and returned safely to Cuba. He could have waited for royal reinforcements, obeyed every instruction, and lived a life of comfortable mediocrity. But he chose a far more dangerous, far more powerful path, to seize destiny in his own hands, and to gamble everything on the possibility of greatness. And in that choice, the stage was set for an event so monumental, so transformative, that it would be remembered for centuries, not just as conquest, but as a collision of ambition, culture, and human destiny. When Cortés' men first stepped onto Aztec soil, it wasn't just their presence that caused alarm. It was the noise, the fire, and the shine of things the Aztecs had never seen before. Imagine standing in a bustling market in Tenochtitlan, surrounded by the familiar sounds of traders, drums, and chanting priests, when suddenly the air is pierced by thunderous cracks, smoke curls into your eyes, and men on beasts twice your size charge toward you, screaming in a language you cannot understand. That was the first encounter. That was fear. Cortés brought weapons that were alien to the Americas, steel swords that could slice through obsidian armor, crossbows that struck with terrifying precision, and arquebuses, primitive guns that roared like gods and spat fire and death. But it wasn't just the weapons. It was the combination, armor that reflected sunlight, cavalry that moved faster than any foot soldier, and men trained not just to fight, but to intimidate. Imagine the confusion in the eyes of a warrior raised to honor ritual and strategy, suddenly confronted by technology that seemed magical, unstoppable, and cruelly efficient. Horses alone were a shock to the Aztecs. Never before had they seen creatures so powerful, so fast, and so obedient to a human's command. Cortés' men rode with purpose, using their height and speed to strike fear before the first blow landed. The sight of a horse charging through the plaza was enough to scatter soldiers and civilians alike. Fear, as much as steel, became a weapon. Cortés understood this. He knew that before a man could be killed, he could be made to hesitate, panic, and falter. And hesitation in a warrior trained for discipline can be fatal. Then there were the psychological tools. Cannons, although crude by European standards, created shockwaves that rattled windows, temples, and hearts. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, unfamiliar and terrifying. Each explosion was more than a weapon. It was a statement. These men carried powers beyond comprehension. The Aztecs, who had fought countless wars and subjugated countless peoples, suddenly faced an enemy whose abilities felt almost supernatural. And yet, Cortés did not rely solely on terror. Steel and gunpowder were tools, not the full measure of conquest. His strategy combined technology with deception, diplomacy, and psychological manipulation. He treated fear like a sculptor treats clay, molding it carefully, using it to separate allies from enemies, to break morale, and to control perception. A single display of power could sway an entire city, and Cortés ensured that each encounter amplified the illusion of invincibility. This terror had a cascading effect. Local tribes, long oppressed or resentful of Aztec rule, began to question whether their loyalty was worth the risk. When the unknown Spaniards arrived, many saw an opportunity. They whispered to one another, "Perhaps these men could help overthrow the empire that had dominated us for decades." Cortés didn't need to conquer every city with violence. In many cases, fear and strategic alliances did the work for him. Steel and gunpowder opened doors, cunning and diplomacy pushed them wide. But there was a cost, even for Cortés' men. Firearms were unreliable, horses could be spooked, and the dense jungles, canals, and unfamiliar terrain often turned advantage into risk. Cortés had to adapt constantly. He learned to use his weapons, not just for battle, but for intimidation, showing enough force to unnerve without overextending his lines. He studied the Aztecs' responses carefully, timing attacks, retreats, and displays of power with precision. The war was not just physical, it was mental, a battle of perception as much as swords. Here's the terrifying part. The Aztecs' first encounters were enough to plant doubt. How do you fight an enemy who seems unstoppable, who rides monsters, who speaks in tongues you cannot understand, and who carries thunder in their hands? Their priests tried to interpret the meaning, their warriors trained harder, yet the uncertainty gnawed at them. Cortés understood that fear, carefully applied, could be more effective than outright slaughter, and in many ways it was. By combining advanced weaponry, cavalry, and calculated psychological terror, Cortés created an aura of invincibility. Every skirmish reinforced it, every display of power amplified it, and every hesitation by the Aztecs, a retreat here, a misjudgment there, became another tool in Cortés's hands. He was not just a general, he was a master of perception, shaping reality before the first siege even began. Imagine the weight of facing this as an Aztec warrior. You had trained your entire life for battle, strategy, and sacrifice. You had fought neighboring tribes, defended your city, and obeyed the gods with unwavering faith. And now you confront men who combine speed, steel, and terror in ways your ancestors never imagined. The rules have changed, the ground has shifted, and the very nature of war feels alien. Cortés weaponized this confusion. He knew that once doubt enters the mind, fear follows, and fear is often stronger than courage. By the time the Spaniards pressed further inland, the combination of technology, strategy, and terror had already begun to erode the Aztecs' sense of invulnerability. Cortés' army was small, but the illusion of power he projected was immense, and history shows that empires can crumble not only under swords but under fear, uncertainty, and the sudden realization that the world is no longer what it seemed. The legacy of this moment is stark. Steel and firearms alone did not topple the Aztec Empire, but the mastery of fear, the calculated use of alien weapons, and the psychological pressure applied from the very first encounters created an opening that Cortés would exploit with relentless precision. The Aztecs were proud, skilled, and disciplined, yet no amount of courage could fully counter a force that reshaped the rules of battle overnight. In the chaos of conquest, history often remembers kings and generals, swords and battles, gold and fire. But sometimes, the smallest figures leave the deepest marks. Malinche, also known as Doña Marina, was one of those figures. Imagine being a young woman, uprooted from your homeland, and suddenly finding yourself at the center of a collision between two worlds. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not even a soldier, yet her choices, her voice, and her intelligence would alter the destiny of millions. Malinche was born into the nobility of a local tribe, but life had already turned against her. She was given as a gift or sold into slavery, sources vary, and found herself in the hands of the Maya before eventually being handed to the Spaniards. Imagine that, a girl stripped of her home, her family, and her childhood, forced to navigate a world ruled by strangers, swords, and foreign gods. Her survival depended on adaptation, cunning, and wit, and in that crucible she discovered her power. Cortés quickly recognized her value. She could speak both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Mayan languages, allowing communication between cultures that would otherwise remain locked in misunderstanding. But Malinche was more than a translator. She became his advisor, strategist, and in many ways the bridge between two civilizations. Every conversation she facilitated, every negotiation she guided, shaped outcomes that no sword could achieve alone. Here's the shocking truth. Without Malinche, the Spanish conquest might have stalled, or even failed. She understood Aztec culture, rituals, and politics in a way Cortés never could. She knew who feared Moctezuma, who resented Aztec dominance, and which allies could be swayed with promises of freedom or vengeance. Her intelligence allowed Cortés to exploit divisions, sow doubt, and manipulate loyalty. She wielded words as effectively as swords, and in doing so changed history. But her role came with immense personal cost. Imagine being a young woman caught between the ambitions of a foreign invader and the people of your homeland. Every word she spoke, every translation, every choice placed lives, including her own, at risk. She could not fully align with either side without consequences. Aztecs would see her as a traitor, Spaniards would see her as a tool. Yet she endured, not as a passive participant, but as an active force shaping the unfolding events. Malinche's story also reveals something deeper about conquest itself. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by understanding, by psychology, and by the ability to navigate human complexity. Malinche embodies that truth. While men brandished steel and fired cannons, she wielded knowledge, trust, and influence, the invisible weapons that can achieve what armies sometimes cannot. And here's the subtle tragedy. History often portrays her as either a traitor or a saint, a savior or a pawn. Few recognize the human cost she bore. She was forced into an impossible position, navigating between survival, loyalty, and ambition. She had little choice in her role, yet her actions shaped the destiny of an empire. Imagine that burden, the lives of thousands, the rise and fall of kings, and the reshaping of a civilization, all dependent in part on the words of a single woman. Malinche also understood strategy beyond mere translation. She advised Cortés on timing, on alliances, and on when to display power or restraint. Her guidance ensured that even the small Spanish force could appear overwhelming. To the Aztecs, it seemed as though a mighty army had arrived, when in reality, much of the conquest was psychological, built on persuasion, miscommunication, and carefully planted fear. Malinche was the linchpin. And yet, despite her brilliance, she lived in shadows. Her name is often reduced to labels, traitor to some, helper to others. But the truth is far more complex. Malinche survived by understanding human nature better than anyone else. She leveraged her position in a dangerous world to assert influence, ensure her survival, and, whether she intended or not, shape the course of history. Her story reminds us that power is not always about armies or crowns. Sometimes it resides in the subtle, intelligent actions of those forced to navigate impossible circumstances. By the time Cortés entered Tenochtitlán, Malinche had already prepared the ground. She spoke to the people, she advised on negotiations, and she interpreted every nuance of Aztec custom. Without her, messages could have been misunderstood, diplomacy could have failed, and the Spanish conquest might have become a bloody stalemate. Her intelligence was both shield and sword, guiding the Spaniards through a world that could have destroyed them in days. Imagine the weight she carried, every word she translated, Every decision she influenced, potentially life or death for soldiers, nobles, and entire cities. She was young, yet her mind and instincts were centuries ahead. Cortes recognized this, relied on her, and allowed her voice to carry the power that few men would have admitted existed in a woman. History often forgets the people who operate in silence, but Malinche's impact echoes through every account of the conquest. In the story of the Aztec Empire's fall, Malinche is not merely a footnote. She is a force of intellect, courage, and survival. She demonstrates a truth that conquest is never one-sided. While steel and horses terrify, it is knowledge, language, and strategy that truly bend fate. And she reminds us that behind every empire brought low, there are unseen actors whose choices shape the course of civilization. In 1519, the Aztec Empire was not just a political power, it was a civilization guided by prophecy, myth, and divine expectation. Every king, every warrior, every priest believed that their actions were part of a cosmic order. And in this world, the arrival of Hernán Cortés and his men was interpreted through the lens of legend. Imagine a ruler hearing of pale-skinned strangers arriving from the east, riding beasts no one has ever seen, carrying weapons that roar like thunder. Could they be men? Or were they gods returned, as prophecy had foretold? Moctezuma II, the emperor, found himself paralyzed by this question. For years, rumors had circulated about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who, according to legend, would one day return from the east. The timing of Cortés' arrival, almost precisely as predicted, unnerved him. Here was a man whose very presence seemed to fulfill ancient prophecy, and yet he was unmistakably mortal. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. Your faith, your understanding of the world, and the stability of your empire suddenly shaken by an arrival you cannot fully comprehend. This uncertainty had consequences. Instead of meeting the Spaniards with military force, Moctezuma chose diplomacy, gifts, and cautious hospitality. He sent emissaries with gold, precious feathers, and words of peace, gestures meant to placate rather than provoke. But history would later judge this hesitation as weakness, and yet it was rooted in fear, faith, and the weight of prophecy. Leaders make decisions based on what they believe, not always what they see, and Moctezuma's choices reveal the tragic power of belief in shaping the course of history. For the Spaniards, this confusion worked perfectly. Cortés understood the role of prophecy and psychology better than anyone. He allowed Moctezuma's uncertainty to fester, exploiting the emperor's reverence and fear. Every gift returned, every gesture of deference, every moment of hesitation reinforced the illusion that the strangers were more than men, that perhaps they were divine. Fear, as much as swords, was becoming a weapon in the conquest to come. Meanwhile, the Aztec people were caught in a wave of anxiety and wonder. Some believed the Spaniards were gods and treated them with awe. Others felt unease, questioning what such an unusual arrival meant for their city and their lives. The tension spread like a silent contagion through Tenochtitlan. Traders whispered, priests debated, and warriors trained in preparation for conflict that may never come. Every moment of indecision, every clash of interpretation weakened the empire from within. Imagine standing in the emperor's palace, surrounded by gold, jade, and the elaborate architecture of Tenochtitlan, and seeing men you cannot categorize. They are terrifying, inscrutable, and yet not divine enough to reconcile with your beliefs. Your advisors urge caution, your priests warn against hubris, and your own intuition, trained to respect both human cunning and divine will, fails to provide clarity. Moctezuma's dilemma was as psychological as it was political. The prophecy didn't just affect Moctezuma, it infiltrated the entire Aztec worldview. Soldiers hesitated, councils debated endlessly, and the social fabric strained under the weight of uncertainty. Cortés, observing from the outside, needed no violence yet to exert power. The mere suggestion that he might be a god destabilized the ruling structure. And this was the first real victory of the Spaniards, not a battle won with swords, but a battle won in the minds of the people they were about to conquer. This tension set the stage for tragedy. When Cortés finally entered Tenochtitlan, he was not just a foreign invader. He was the embodiment of the prophecy, the unknown force that could neither be fully resisted nor fully understood. Moctezuma's hesitation, rooted in faith and fear, would cost him dearly. He allowed the Spaniards into the heart of his empire, believing it might be the correct course, when in reality it gave them access to the very foundations of power, the palace, the nobles, and the pulse of the city. Prophecy, in this case, became a weapon. Cortés understood human belief, and he exploited it ruthlessly. Every hesitation, every act of reverence, every gift sent, allowed the Spaniards to consolidate influence. The Aztecs' devotion to gods made them vulnerable to men who could manipulate perception. And in this collision of faith and ambition, tragedy was inevitable. History often simplifies conquest as the triumph of men over empires, of swords over cities. But the fall of Tenochtitlan demonstrates something far more subtle and far more devastating. Human belief, prophecy, and psychological uncertainty can be as decisive as any weapon. The Aztec Empire, so confident in its rituals, its gods, and its order, was destabilized long before the first cannon fired. And in the quiet corridors of Moctezuma's palace, the seeds of surrender and disaster were already being sown. Imagine the emperor's fear that the strangers were both mortal and divine, that every decision carried the weight of gods and humans, that hesitation could cost not just his life, but the lives of thousands. This is the moment where prophecy becomes destiny, where belief becomes strategy, and where the human mind, vulnerable, reverent, and fearful, becomes the battlefield itself. And so, as Cortés advanced, the Aztecs faced an impossible question. How do you fight men who might be gods? How do you protect an empire when the very foundation of your faith shakes? In this uncertainty, Cortés found his advantage, and the story of conquest moved from the realm of war into the realm of psychology, a battle of perception, faith, and fear that no Aztec sword could ever fully counter. The journey to Tenochtitlan was more than a march through forests and rivers. It was a journey into the heart of an empire, into the unknown, and into a destiny that would reshape the world. Cortés and his men traveled inland with purpose, moving through rugged terrain, swamps and jungles that tested every ounce of their endurance. Every day brought new challenges: hostile tribes, unfamiliar wildlife, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of rebellion within their own ranks. Yet every step brought them closer to the city that would become the epicenter of history. Imagine walking alongside Cortés. You see the determination etched on his face, the way his eyes constantly scan for opportunity and danger. Around you, men murmur in awe at the strange landscapes, forests so dense that sunlight barely touches the ground, rivers flowing with an intensity that seems almost alive, and cliffs that appear impossible to traverse. Each obstacle could kill, each delay could ruin their plans, yet there is a sense of inevitability. The city waits, and they will reach it. But the march was not fought with swords alone. Cortés relied on diplomacy, alliances, and the careful manipulation of fear. Along the way, he encountered tribes who had long suffered under Aztec rule, paying tribute and living under the threat of conquest. These tribes saw the Spaniards as a tool for their liberation. Cortés promised them freedom, protection, and vengeance, creating an alliance that would provide him with thousands of warriors. By the time he approached Tenochtitlan, he was no longer a small expeditionary force. He had become the spearhead of a coalition fueled by ambition, resentment, and hope. And yet, for all his cunning, Cortés had to maintain absolute control. Marching through hostile territory required discipline. Every man had to obey orders. Every soldier had to trust the path forward, even when it seemed impossible. The Spaniards were far from home, surrounded by unknown dangers, facing enemies with numbers far greater than their own. Fear lurked in every shadow, from the winding rivers to the dense forests. Yet Cortés transformed that fear into unity. He understood a fundamental truth: Men fight harder when they believe in a leader who has already calculated the way forward. The closer they drew to Tenochtitlan, the more intense the tension became. The terrain shifted, revealing marshes, lakes and causeways, a landscape designed to defend the city, to make invasion nearly impossible. Cortes studied every inch, noting where bridges could be crossed, where ambushes might lie, and where he could turn natural defenses into traps for the Aztecs themselves. He treated the land like a chessboard, each decision carefully measured, every move part of a larger strategy. Along the road, Cortes faced moments that could have undone the expedition. Ambushes by hostile tribes tested his men's courage. Supplies ran low. Some allies faltered, and yet he remained calm, unshakable, projecting confidence that inspired loyalty even when the path seemed insurmountable. Imagine the weight of responsibility, thousands of men, hundreds of horses, entire tribes depending on your judgment. One mistake, one misstep, and the journey could have ended in disaster. But Cortes thrived in risk, and his vision never wavered. As they neared the city, the signs of the Aztec Empire's wealth and sophistication became impossible to ignore. Floating gardens glimmered in the sunlight, canals reflected the sky like mirrors, and distant temples loomed like mountains of stone. The Spaniards, accustomed to European cities and forests, were awestruck. Cortes knew the psychological impact of this display. His men had seen wealth, but this was on a scale they could hardly comprehend. It reinforced their sense of purpose and the stakes of their mission. If they succeeded, the rewards would be unmatched. The alliances Cortes formed along the way also shaped the upcoming battle. Thousands of indigenous warriors, motivated by revenge and the promise of freedom, now marched alongside the Spaniards. Cortes carefully balanced power, ensuring loyalty while preventing rebellion within his coalition. Every word, every promise, every act of intimidation was designed to consolidate influence. He understood that victory would not come from numbers alone, but from unity and strategy, and he wielded both with precision. By the time the city came into view, tension had reached its peak. Cortes' small army, now bolstered by thousands of allies, stood on the cusp of a civilization that seemed almost divine. Canals reflected sunlight, like rivers of gold, pyramids soared into the sky, and every bridge, plaza, and temple was a reminder of the empire's dominance. For the Aztecs, this was home. For the Spaniards, it was a prize. And for both, destiny was about to collide. The road to Tenochtitlan was not just physical, it was psychological, political, and spiritual. Cortes had turned the journey itself into a campaign of preparation. By the time he arrived, he had studied the land, secured allies, tested loyalty, and calculated fear. He had molded his men into an unstoppable force, ready to strike not just with swords, but with cunning, strategy, and psychological mastery. The city that awaited them was magnificent, terrifying, and ripe for conquest, yet it had no idea what waited at its gates. The moment Cortes first laid eyes on Moctezuma II, history shifted. It was not just a meeting of two men, it was a collision of worlds, belief systems, and destinies. Imagine stepping into the grand palace of Tenochtitlan, where every wall gleams with gold, every floor vibrates with the weight of ceremony, and the air is thick with incense and expectation. And there he stands, the emperor, clad in intricate feathers and jade, a living god to his people, yet human enough to radiate fear, uncertainty, and caution. Cortes, on the other hand, walked in with the confidence of a man who believed the gods themselves had paved the path for his conquest. He was acutely aware of every gesture, every word, every expression. This was a delicate dance. One misstep could provoke a massacre, or a display of deference could open the door to unimaginable power. Cortes understood that diplomacy here was more lethal than any sword. Cortes understood that diplomacy here was more lethal than any sword. But behind the golden smiles and polished politeness lurked fear. Could these strangers truly be divine? Could they bring destruction in ways no prophecy had fully predicted? Every word Moctezuma spoke carried the weight of his empire, yet his eyes betrayed hesitation. Imagine the pressure, every citizen, every priest, every soldier watching, waiting, hoping, fearing that one wrong choice could bring ruin. The meeting was as much psychological as political. Cortés did not merely negotiate, he performed. Every compliment, every gesture, every careful observation reinforced the illusion of his authority. He allowed Moctezuma's awe and fear to solidify his position. In that room, Cortés became more than a man. He became an agent of inevitability, the embodiment of the prophecy that had haunted the emperor for months. And yet, Cortés had to be careful. One misjudged move, one insult, and the delicate balance could collapse. He needed Moctezuma alive, influential and cooperative, because the city itself depended on the emperor's authority. Without him, chaos could erupt. Cortés was playing a high-stakes game where lives, cities, and empires hung in the balance, and the smallest miscalculation could spell disaster. The emperor's vulnerability was apparent. Moctezuma hesitated, deferred, and consulted his priests, seeking guidance from the gods who had ruled his decisions for decades. Cortés exploited this. He recognized that an empire built on ritual and faith could be manipulated through perception and uncertainty. A city could be brought to its knees, not just with weapons, but with strategy, timing, and subtle intimidation, and there was awe on both sides. The Spaniards were dazzled by the opulence, sophistication, and scale of Tenochtitlan. Gold glimmered on every surface, canals reflected the sun like liquid mirrors, and temples soared higher than any European cathedral. For the Aztecs, the Spaniards' horses, guns, and strange appearance were equally mesmerizing. Both sides were caught between admiration, fear, and the realization that they were witnessing a historic encounter, one that would ripple across continents and centuries. Here's the most chilling part. Cortés did not attack immediately. Instead, he stayed, observed, and subtly imposed influence. Moctezuma, unsure whether to submit, negotiate, or resist, unwittingly gave Cortés access to the inner workings of the empire. The Spaniards moved freely within the capital, learning, assessing, and manipulating, while the emperor struggled with a question that would haunt him. Were these men mortal, or were they gods, and how could one govern against the unknown? The tension in the palace was unbearable. Priests whispered warnings, nobles debated, torn between loyalty and fear. Citizens watched from afar, sensing that history was being made, yet unable to grasp its magnitude. Every gesture mattered, every expression was scrutinized, and every conversation carried the weight of survival or annihilation. Moctezuma, the mighty emperor, found himself constrained not by enemy armies, but by belief, prophecy, and the very weight of expectation. Cortés' genius in this moment was clear. He recognized the psychological levers, the vulnerabilities in faith, the cracks in the foundation of power. By controlling perception, he turned diplomacy into conquest. The emperor, who had ruled an empire of millions, was now maneuvered like a pawn, aware yet unable to fully resist, respectful yet terrified, powerful yet powerless. And so, when the Spaniards left the palace that day, it was more than a meeting concluded. It was a strategic victory, a psychological triumph, and the quiet beginning of the unraveling of one of the greatest civilizations in the world. Moctezuma would remain emperor, yet he had unknowingly ceded control. Cortés had entered the heart of the empire, not with fire, but with cunning, observation, and the terrifying subtlety of a man who understood that domination often begins in the mind before it reaches the sword. Victory, as Cortés soon learned, is never guaranteed, even when strategy seems perfect. After months inside Tenochtitlan, tensions had built to a breaking point. The Aztec city, vibrant, complex, and proud, had begun to resist the Spaniards' presence. Every whispered conversation, every fearful glance, and every act of defiance reminded Cortés that he was a guest in a world that could swallow him whole. And then came the night that would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Imagine standing in the darkness, canals reflecting the moonlight, hearing the sounds of battle erupting around you. Cortés' men were trapped, outnumbered and desperate. The Aztecs, enraged by occupation, launched a coordinated attack. The city that had seemed so welcoming became a labyrinth of danger, every street a potential trap, every bridge a deadly bottleneck. The Spaniards had to fight their way out, carrying gold, wounded comrades, and the crushing weight of fear. The casualties were staggering. Soldiers fell into canals, drowning in the very water that had once glittered in sunlight. Horses plunged into the depths, weapons lost, men slaughtered. The Spaniards had underestimated the power of the city and the determination of its defenders. For every step they tried to take toward freedom, the Aztecs pushed back with fury and precision. Imagine the terror of running through a city you had believed under your control, only to realize that every familiar street had become hostile territory. Cortés himself was wounded that night, a stark reminder that no strategy can guarantee safety. He had planned meticulously, yet chaos erupted, fueled by anger, betrayal, and desperation. His men, exhausted and terrified, struggled to maintain order, to retreat without being annihilated. Each moment was a fight for survival, and every decision carried the weight of life or death. The Night of Sorrows was not just a military disaster, it was an emotional and psychological trial that tested courage, leadership, and endurance to the limit. The psychological toll on the men was immense. They had seen comrades die in unimaginable ways, watched their loot sink into the canals, and felt the oppressive power of the city around them. Fear, despair, and regret intertwined. Cortés understood that this night would define them, that survival required more than strength. It required resilience, cunning, and the ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. Imagine the haunting memory of dragging yourself through streets you had hoped to conquer, hearing cries of battle, and watching your world collapse around you. Yet even in defeat, Cortés' brilliance emerged. He regrouped his men, salvaged what he could, and began planning a return with a clearer understanding of the stakes. He learned that conquest would not be won by underestimating the Aztecs, by relying solely on fear and intimidation.
The city, its people, and its culture were resilient, intelligent, and prepared to defend what was theirs. The Night of Sorrows became a lesson in humility, strategy, and the harsh realities of human ambition. This night also had profound implications for the Aztecs.
They celebrated their victory, having driven out the invaders and reclaimed their streets. But it was a temporary triumph. Cortés would return, wiser, stronger, and more determined. The encounter revealed the weaknesses of the Spaniards, but it also revealed the cracks within Aztec society, the alliances Cortés had cultivated, the discontent simmering among tributary tribes, and the vulnerabilities in leadership that could be exploited. La Noche Triste is remembered not just as a battle, but as a turning point in human history. It encapsulates the volatility of conquest, the unpredictability of resistance, and the brutal reality that even the most calculated plans can falter. Cortés' retreat was a moment of sorrow, but also of preparation, reflection, and relentless ambition. He would not be defeated by fear, he would learn, adapt, and return. Imagine the streets of Tenochtitlan in that night, the chaos, the desperation, the clash of cultures, and the haunting cries of those who would never see another dawn. The Spaniards survived, but their pride was shattered. The Aztecs had defended their city, but their empire was still vulnerable. The Night of Sorrows stands as a testament to the cost of ambition, the unpredictability of war, and the human capacity to endure terror, loss, and uncertainty, and to rise again. After La Noche Triste, Tenochtitlan was no longer just a city. It was a battleground of fear, anger, and calculated cruelty. Cortés returned, not as a visitor, but as a force of vengeance and strategy. Imagine a man whose pride had been wounded, whose ambition burned hotter than ever, returning to a city that had mocked his authority. For Cortés, this was no longer conquest, it was a message. Defiance would not be tolerated. The streets that once shimmered with gold and life became arenas of terror. Cortés knew that to break the empire, he had to break its people, not just its armies, but their will to resist. Alliances with discontented tribes gave him inside knowledge. Every rival of the Aztecs, every citizen who had suffered under tribute, became a tool. Betrayal, long simmering under the surface of the empire, became a weapon wielded with precision. Allies struck at the city from within, while Spanish steel cut through the defenders outside. And yet, the brutality went beyond strategy. It was deliberate, terrifying, and psychological. Every plaza cleared of Aztec warriors, every temple desecrated, every punishment inflicted on the population was a lesson. Rebellion came at a cost. Cortés understood that fear, once cultivated, would spread faster than any army. Mothers hid their children, priests whispered of doom, and the citizens of Tenochtitlan began to understand a chilling truth. The invaders would not merely conquer, they would punish, reshape and dominate. The violence was personal as well as strategic. Cortés' men, frustrated by earlier setbacks, vented rage on the city, creating a cycle of vengeance and terror. Aztec warriors who had fought bravely in La Noche Triste found themselves hunted, ambushed and slaughtered. Streets ran with blood, homes burned. The line between survival and death blurred. Imagine the terror of seeing your neighbor, your brother or your child taken or killed for defying a small foreign force. The empire that had once seemed invincible now quaked under the weight of relentless brutality. Yet betrayal was not just external. Inside Tenochtitlan, political divisions erupted. Nobles who feared Cortés's wrath and envied Moctezuma's authority made deals with the Spaniards, revealing secret passages, advising on defensive weaknesses, and undermining the emperor's rule. Moctezuma, trapped between loyalty, fear, and prophecy, became increasingly powerless. History often portrays him as weak, but the truth is far more tragic. He was bound by faith, tradition, and the expectations of millions, while men who understood strategy and fear manipulated every decision. Cortés used these fractures with cold efficiency. He orchestrated massacres, not indiscriminately, but with chilling intent. Leaders were captured or executed, resistance was crushed, and the psychological impact reverberated through every street and temple. Survival often depended not on courage, but on who had aligned with the Spaniards, who had betrayed their neighbors, and who had the fortune to escape immediate notice. The empire was unraveling from the inside out, as much as from the swords of the invaders. And still, the Spaniards had to maintain discipline. Violence had to be controlled to ensure strategic objectives. Cortés knew that brutality without purpose could backfire, turning allies against him or galvanizing defenders. Every act of terror was calculated, measured to instill fear and obedience, while maintaining the loyalty of his coalition. He balanced ruthlessness with cunning, knowing that the fall of the empire required both. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Aztecs died during skirmishes and massacres. Families were torn apart, temples desecrated, and the social fabric of the city shredded. For the Spaniards, survival and victory came at the expense of conscience. For the Aztecs, the realization was clear: the empire that had dominated the region for centuries was vulnerable, mortal, and subject to the merciless logic of ambition and betrayal. Blood-stained, not just streets but history. Betrayal flowed through secret channels, breaking loyalty and trust. Brutality became both a weapon and a warning, a demonstration of power that ensured submission. Cortés' conquest was more than physical. It was a psychological siege, a deliberate dismantling of belief, unity and hope. Yet even in this horror, the Spaniards' small numbers could have faltered without the careful orchestration of alliances and strategy. Cortés understood that fear, deception and violence combined could achieve what brute force alone never could. By the time Tenochtitlan trembled under siege, the city's defenders were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly uncertain of who to trust. Betrayal had become as deadly as steel. La Noche Triste had been a warning, now the response was merciless. Cortés and his men had learned the language of fear, the calculus of loyalty, and the weight of brutality. The empire would crumble, not in a single battle, but through a relentless combination of psychological pressure, strategic alliances, and devastating violence. And in the hearts of the Aztecs, the truth became impossible to ignore. Their gods might have guided them, their warriors might have been brave, but the invaders had learned the deepest secret of conquest, that fear, betrayal, and brutality often decide the fate of civilizations. By the time Cortés tightened his grip on Tenochtitlan, an enemy far deadlier than swords or cannons had already begun its work. Smallpox, invisible, merciless, unstoppable, swept through the city like a silent storm. Imagine a population unprepared for a disease brought by strangers from across the ocean. The Aztecs had no immunity, no knowledge, no defenses. One cough, one touch, one contaminated object could mean death, and soon the streets echoed with the cries of the sick and dying. The timing of smallpox was devastating. The psychological and military blows of Cortés' campaigns had already weakened the city. Now disease attacked from within, families were struck down overnight, entire households vanished. Mothers clutched children who would never wake again. The proud warriors who had resisted the Spaniards were immobilized by fever and rash. The empire, already trembling under the weight of betrayal and fear, now faced annihilation in ways they could neither see nor fight. This invisible weapon altered everything. Cortés, knowingly or unknowingly, benefited from its spread. Every epidemic death weakened morale. Every household lost created panic. Every empty street amplified fear. The Aztecs, interpreting disease through spiritual and cultural lenses, believed they were cursed or punished by the gods. Fear, despair, and uncertainty became as lethal as any cannon. Imagine standing amidst your people, watching them wither and die, unable to intervene, powerless to stop the unseen force consuming them. Smallpox did not discriminate. Nobles, priests, commoners, all succumbed. Moctezuma himself would not escape its reach, and the emperor's authority eroded with every death. The people began to lose faith, questioning both divine protection and leadership. Cortés's army, though small in number, advanced with confidence. They had weapons, allies, and strategy, and now nature itself became an ally, reshaping the balance of power in ways no human effort could achieve. The human suffering was unimaginable. Parents were forced to bury children, siblings watched each other die, and caregivers faced impossible choices: who could be saved, who must be left behind. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Cities that once teemed with life now bore a quiet, horrifying weight. And yet, the Spanish chroniclers often described this devastation with detachment, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the suffering it caused. History remembers the conquest as strategy and bravery, but rarely the personal anguish of those struck down by invisible death. For Cortés, smallpox was an unintentional weapon, but its impact was undeniable. The disease broke resistance where steel could not, undermined leadership where loyalty faltered, and shattered society from within. Every death was a ripple, every illness a chain reaction, and every panic-stricken citizen weakened the capacity of Tenochtitlan to defend itself. The invisible enemy did what armies and diplomacy could only attempt. It softened the empire, making conquest inevitable. Yet even in the midst of suffering, human courage emerged. Some Aztecs risked infection to care for the sick. Some attempted to organize resistance despite the epidemic, but the scale of devastation was overwhelming. Civilization itself seemed to unravel. Streets once alive with commerce and ceremony became silent corridors of fear, grief, and death. Imagine walking through a city where neighbors vanish day by day, temples echo with emptiness, and the certainty of life itself is stripped away. Smallpox did not just kill bodies, it shattered confidence, morale, and hope. The city's defenses weakened as caretakers fell ill, soldiers deserted, and leadership struggled to maintain order. Cortés' forces, meanwhile, advanced with lethal efficiency, aware or unaware that disease was tilting the scales in their favor. The empire that had resisted for centuries now crumbled quietly, invisibly, in the shadow of sickness. By the time Cortés prepared the final assault, Tenochtitlan was no longer just weakened by war, it was hollowed by an epidemic that spared neither palace nor home. The combination of fear, betrayal, and disease made the impossible conquest almost certain. The Spaniards would strike, yes, but nature had already begun the work. And in that terrifying, silent devastation, history reveals a truth both shocking and undeniable. Sometimes conquest is not decided by sword or cannon, but by a virus that no human can see, no ritual can appease, and no army can defeat. August 13, 1521, a date that would echo across centuries, marking the collapse of an empire that had once seemed invincible. Tenochtitlan, the jewel of Mesoamerica, the heart of Aztec civilization, was on fire, surrounded, and breaking under the relentless assault of Cortés' forces. Imagine standing on the canal's edge, seeing smoke rise from temples, hearing the screams of the wounded, and witnessing a city that had thrived for centuries reduced to chaos and despair. The siege was meticulous. Cortés and his allies cut off supplies, surrounded the city with brigades of warriors and cannons, and targeted key positions to systematically dismantle defenses. The canals, once the lifelines of the city, became obstacles that trapped defenders and forced desperate crossings under gunfire. Every block of stone, every palace, every temple became both a weapon and a battleground. The Aztecs fought with courage, but exhaustion, disease, and betrayal had hollowed their strength. Imagine the despair of the citizens. Starvation gnawed at children and elders alike. Disease, still raging from smallpox, claimed lives even as warriors clashed in the streets. Mothers clutched the bodies of their dead. Priests recited prayers to gods who seemed silent, and soldiers, once proud and disciplined, stumbled in confusion and terror. The city that had been a symbol of power, wealth, and divine authority was now a cage of suffering. Moctezuma's legacy, already tarnished by hesitation and fear, reached its tragic conclusion. He had attempted diplomacy, had tried to navigate prophecy and fear, yet his empire crumbled despite his efforts. His presence, once a stabilizing force, could no longer hold back the tide, and the psychological toll on the remaining defenders was immense. Every bridge destroyed, every ally turned against them, every familiar street turned into a trap, reminded them that their world was ending. Cortés, relentless and calculating, knew that total domination required both brutality and patience. The Spaniards stormed temples, toppled idols, and desecrated sacred spaces, breaking not just bodies but spirits. Every act of violence was symbolic, a warning to those who survived that resistance was futile. And yet, he allowed no cruelty to spiral beyond control. Discipline, fear, and strategy worked together in a chilling symphony, ensuring that conquest was complete and irreversible. The psychological aspect was as decisive as the physical. Citizens were forced to witness the fall of their leaders, the death of their families, and the destruction of sacred temples. Despair spread faster than any army could march. The empire's social fabric unraveled, leaving only panic, grief, and submission. Every Aztec, from noble to commoner, understood that the world they knew was ending. Imagine the weight of that realization, centuries of culture, tradition, and faith collapsing around you in weeks. And then the final battles. Streets ran red with blood, canals choked with debris, and temples crumbled under siege. Cortés' forces, small but precise, exploited every weakness, turning betrayal, fear, and exhaustion into a weapon more lethal than any blade. The Aztecs fought valiantly, but history often remembers, not just courage, but timing and circumstance. Tenochtitlan's fall was inevitable, not just because of foreign swords, but because of the combination of alliances, disease, betrayal, and psychological warfare. When the city finally surrendered, silence followed, not peace, but the heavy quiet of devastation. Survivors emerged into a transformed landscape, once magnificent palaces reduced to ruins, temples defiled, and the streets littered with bodies and memories. Cortés had achieved the impossible. The heart of the Aztec Empire lay broken, and the Spaniards now held dominion over a civilization that had dominated the region for centuries. Yet the human cost cannot be overstated. Tens of thousands of Aztecs perished. Families, culture, and tradition were destroyed. The fall of Tenochtitlán was not just a military victory, it was a humanitarian catastrophe, a profound tragedy that marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. And within that catastrophe, the resilience of survivors, their grief, endurance, and memory, carried the story of what had been lost. The fall of Tenochtitlan teaches a chilling truth. Empires are fragile, even when they appear eternal. Wealth, devotion, faith, and might can be undone by cunning, alliances, disease, and the psychological forces that shape human behavior. Cortés' conquest was not merely the triumph of one man or one army, it was the collision of worlds, the exploitation of human weakness, and the devastating power of strategy executed with precision. And so, as smoke rose over the canals, as ruins replaced temples, and as the cries of the fallen echoed through the city, the Aztec Empire breathed its last. The conquest was complete, and a new era had begun, one written in blood, gold, and the memory of a civilization that had dared to reach the skies, only to fall under the weight of an invisible, unstoppable, and unrelenting tide. The city lay in ruins, but victory was far from the end of Cortés' story. Tenochtitlan had fallen, its canals choked with debris, its temples toppled, and its streets silent with grief. Yet conquest did not automatically bring peace. Imagine walking through the ruins of a city that once gleamed like gold, where the echoes of laughter, ceremony, and worship had been replaced by smoke, silence, and the cries of the wounded. Victory had been claimed, but stability remained a distant dream. The surviving Aztecs were a fractured people. Families were scattered, leaders dead or imprisoned, and communities traumatized by betrayal, bloodshed, and disease. Cortés now faced the immense challenge of consolidating control over a civilization whose loyalty was uncertain and whose anger was still smoldering. The streets that had once been full of pride and ceremony were now filled with fear, suspicion, and the weight of mourning. Every action he took had to balance brutality with diplomacy, fear with governance. Yet peace proved elusive. Even as the Spaniards occupied the city, uprisings and revolts broke out. Small groups of Aztecs attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and resisted occupation whenever possible. The empire's destruction had not extinguished its spirit. Cortés and his men responded with measured violence, sometimes decisive, sometimes ruthless, to remind the survivors that resistance would not be tolerated. But each act of suppression only deepened resentment and mistrust, ensuring that the conquest was a victory without genuine peace. Disease continued to rage, weakening the population further and adding a layer of desperation to every interaction. Smallpox, hunger, and war had created an environment where survival, not loyalty, became the driving force. Mothers buried children, elders watched in despair, and the once proud empire was reduced to a city of shadows. Cortés' triumph was hollow in some ways. He had defeated armies, toppled rulers, and seized gold, but the human and cultural cost was staggering. Even the Spaniards faced challenges in maintaining control. Cortés had allies among the indigenous tribes, but alliances built on convenience and revenge were fragile. Loyalty was transactional and could shift in an instant. He had to navigate a landscape where every faction had its own agenda, every village held a memory of conquest, and every surviving leader could inspire rebellion. Maintaining dominance over Tenochtitlan required vigilance, cunning, and a constant show of power. Peace, if it existed, was only fragile and enforced. The psychological impact on the Aztecs was profound. The emperor's death, the destruction of sacred temples, and the loss of the city shook the very foundations of faith and culture. Survivors were forced to adapt to new rulers, new laws, and a new social order imposed by outsiders. Religion, governance, and tradition had been violently interrupted. Imagine being a citizen forced to navigate a world where your gods' temples were destroyed, your leaders dead, and your society restructured around foreign authority. The trauma was generational. Cortés' victory, while absolute militarily, was incomplete culturally. The Aztec Empire had been shattered, yet the spirit of its people, their stories and their memories, could not be erased entirely. Even under occupation, whispers of revolt, clandestine ceremonies, and the preservation of history persisted. Conquest had claimed the city, but not the hearts and minds of the people. Victory without peace was a fragile, uneasy dominion, one maintained through fear, manipulation, and the careful balancing of power. This period also highlights a bitter truth about conquest. The spoils of war, gold, land, titles come at a human cost that can never be fully measured. Cortés had gained wealth, fame, and influence, but every triumph was shadowed by the suffering of countless innocents. Victory was visible in the streets, the palaces, and the wealth of the conquerors, but invisible in the grief of mothers, the loss of children, and the erasure of centuries of culture. Ultimately, the fall of Tenochtitlan was not a moment of celebration for everyone involved. For the Spaniards, it was a stepping stone to further conquest. For the Aztecs, it was the beginning of a long period of subjugation and loss. Cortés had achieved the impossible, but his triumph was a stark reminder that victory does not guarantee peace, happiness, or moral clarity. It is often a fragile, uneasy construct, resting on fear, oppression, and the exhaustion of those who survive. History remembers the fall of Tenochtitlan as a military and political success, but the human cost tells a far more complicated story. Cities burned, lives lost, culture erased, and yet the memory of what was lost persisted, carried in the hearts of survivors. The empire was gone, but its story, its lessons and its tragedies endured, a haunting reminder that victory without peace can leave devastation in its wake. Conquest has a price, one that cannot be measured in gold, land or titles. Cortés had achieved what few thought possible. He had toppled a civilization, seized its capital, and claimed unimaginable wealth for himself and Spain. Yet the cost of that victory was staggering, etched into the lives of the vanquished, the psyche of the conquerors, and the moral fabric of history itself. The human toll was unimaginable. Tens of thousands of Aztecs lay dead, victims of battle, disease, and starvation. Families were torn apart, parents forced to bury children they could not protect, and the survivors were left to navigate a shattered society. Entire traditions, rituals, and ceremonies that had defined the Aztec world for centuries were lost in the flames, replaced by foreign laws, foreign gods, and foreign rulers. Imagine standing in a city where your ancestors had walked for generations, only to see every monument to their faith and culture destroyed, replaced by alien symbols of authority. Even Cortés's own men paid a price. The journey had tested their endurance, their morality, and their loyalty. They witnessed horrors that would haunt them for life, the screams of dying warriors, the suffering of civilians, the despair of mothers clutching dead children, and the devastating consequences of disease and famine. Victory came with exhaustion, guilt, and a constant fear of retaliation. For all their triumphs, no soldier could truly escape the memory of the lives taken, the cities burned, and the souls broken. The moral cost was perhaps the heaviest of all. Cortés' campaigns, while brilliant in strategy, revealed the terrifying reality of human ambition, unchecked by empathy. He used fear, betrayal, and exploitation to achieve his goals, leaving devastation in his wake. History often glorifies conquest, but here the line between genius and ruthlessness blurs. Power was seized, yes, but at the expense of humanity itself. The Aztecs paid with blood, the land paid with ruin, and Cortés paid with a legacy forever intertwined with cruelty and awe. Culturally, the empire was forever altered. Temples were desecrated, sacred texts destroyed, and knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and governance disrupted. Yet in some ways, survival persisted. The Aztec people preserved stories, songs, and memories in secret, passing on fragments of their civilization despite oppression. Conquest had not erased identity entirely, but it had forced adaptation, compromise, and silence. The legacy of a great civilization became a whispered truth, carried in the hearts of those who endured. The economic cost also shaped the world. Gold and treasure flowed to Spain, enriching the empire, but leaving devastation behind. Land was redistributed, communities displaced, and new systems of control imposed. The consequences of these actions reverberated for generations, altering not just Mexico, but the trajectory of colonial history across the Americas. Wealth for one, destruction for many. This was the cruel equation of conquest. And yet, there is a paradox. Cortés' victory also created a new world. The meeting of Europe and the Americas, violent as it was, reshaped human history. Languages, crops, animals, and ideas began to intermingle. The cost was horrific, yes, but it also set the stage for the complex, interconnected societies that would emerge in the centuries to follow. Conquest, therefore, was both destructive and transformative, leaving a legacy that is impossible to ignore. For the Aztecs, the price was deeply personal. Every survivor carried the trauma of loss, the memory of loved ones slain, and the burden of witnessing a civilization fall. Every mother who had lost a child, every warrior who had fought bravely, every priest who had failed to protect sacred knowledge, bore the scars of conquest in ways that no victory could ever erase. These were lives changed forever, and the echoes of that suffering continue in history and memory. For Cortés, the cost was also reputational and spiritual. Though he achieved fame, wealth, and power, he also inherited the burden of history's judgment. Seen as a brilliant strategist by some, a ruthless conqueror by others, he became a figure of both admiration and condemnation. Victory had come at a price, and that price would shadow his legacy for centuries. The price of conquest is rarely fully understood in the moment. Cortés had won battles, toppled empires, and claimed treasures. But at what cost to humanity, culture, and conscience? History remembers the victories, but the losses are just as significant. Every empire conquered leaves behind stories of despair, endurance, and sacrifice. The Aztecs' world was gone, but their memory, their courage, and their suffering remain a testament to the high cost of ambition and power. And so, the fall of the Aztec Empire stands as a chilling lesson. Conquest is never free. Every victory carries the weight of human suffering. Every empire conquered leaves a trail of grief, and every triumph must be measured not just in gold or glory, but in the lives forever altered. Cortés may have gained the world, but the world he gained had already paid a price that could never be forgotten. The conquest was complete, yet for Hernán Cortés, the story did not end with triumph. By the time he returned to Spain, wealth in tow and titles in hand, the man who had toppled an empire found himself navigating a world as complex and treacherous as Tenochtitlan itself. Imagine a hero in the eyes of some, a villain in the eyes of others, haunted not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the judgment of kings, rivals, and history. His victories had made him powerful, but they had also cast a long, dark shadow. Cortés' later years were marked by ambition, frustration, and relentless pursuit of recognition. Despite his achievements, he faced criticism from the Spanish crown. Rumors, political rivals, and bureaucratic intrigues challenged his authority and threatened to strip him of the glory he had fought so hard to claim. For a man who had commanded empires, this struggle with law, influence, and perception was a reminder that even conquerors are vulnerable. Victory on foreign soil did not guarantee peace at home, yet Cortés continued to wield influence, overseeing colonies, managing territories, and seeking new opportunities for expansion. His mind remained sharp, strategic, and unyielding. He understood the delicate balance between fear and respect. loyalty and rebellion, lessons he had learned in the streets, canals and palaces of Tenochtitlan. But as he aged, the realization dawned that his legacy would be contested, interpreted through the lenses of morality, ambition, and the passage of time. And what of the world he had conquered? The Aztec civilization, once a beacon of culture, governance and religion, had been forever altered. Survivors adapted to foreign rule, blending traditions, memories and faith with the imposed Spanish systems. Children grew up hearing whispers of a glorious past. Priests struggled to preserve fragments of knowledge, and families learned to navigate a society built on conquest. Cortés had changed the world irrevocably, leaving a legacy intertwined with suffering, adaptation, and the persistence of memory. The shadow of Cortés' conquest also extended across history itself. Scholars, historians, and storytellers would debate his genius and his cruelty for centuries. Was he a hero of exploration or a ruthless destroyer of civilizations? The answer is not simple, because his story encompasses both. It is a story of ambition, strategy, and audacity, and also of terror, suffering, and the obliteration of a vibrant culture. Cortés' name became a symbol of conquest, a cautionary tale, and a reflection of the complex interplay between human aspiration and the cost it extracts. Even in death, his legacy remained controversial. Cortés died in relative obscurity in 1547, far from the lands he had conquered. Wealth and titles could not erase the haunting question of morality. The empire he had toppled had left indelible marks on his soul, on the societies he ruled, and on history itself. And perhaps that is the most compelling truth. Even the greatest conqueror cannot escape the weight of the worlds he has destroyed. But history also remembers the resilience of those he conquered. The Aztecs' story did not end with Tenochtitlan's fall. Their culture, their identity and their influence survived, transforming into a complex hybrid world where memory and heritage endured. Cortés may have taken their city, their gold and their power, but he could not erase the human spirit, nor the lessons of a civilization that had thrived for centuries. Cortés' final years remind us that conquest is never simple. Triumph can be fleeting, recognition elusive, and legacy contested. Power can be gained, yet the cost in blood, in culture, in human suffering remains permanent. His shadow stretches across continents and centuries, a reminder of ambition, audacity, and the profound consequences of actions driven by desire and greed. When we reflect on Hernán Cortés, we must see more than the man who toppled an empire. We must see the lives reshaped, the cultures altered, the grief endured, and the resilience that survived. History is rarely black and white, but in the story of Cortés and the Aztecs, we glimpse both the heights of human ambition and the depths of its cost. And so the conquest is complete, but the story endures in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, in the descendants of the Aztecs, and in the echoes of history that remind us every empire has a shadow, every triumph a price, and every conqueror a story that cannot be told without remembering those who were lost along the way.